Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our expert webinar chapter recovery moment. Today, we're starting aviation, how to fly safely again. Bienvenidos a nuestra serie de webinars Chapter Recovery Moment, con la sesión Reiniciando la aviación, cómo volver a volar con seguridad. Today we will have a webinar in English with translation into Spanish. Hoy tendremos una webinar en inglés con traducción simultánea al español. Please follow the instruction on our screen to listen to Spanish translation. Por favor, sigan las instrucciones de nuestra pantalla para escuchar la traducción al español. Thanks, Adolfo and Mónica, for performing this task. Gracias a Alfonso y a Mónica que van a realizar la tarea de traducción para vosotros. We will give you a few seconds to the participants to change to Spanish channel. Daremos unos pequeños segundos para que se habilite entonces el canal en español y ustedes puedan, debajo de su pantalla, siguiendo las instrucciones, escucharnos en idioma español si así lo desean. I am Daniela Otero, CEO of Skål International. I would like to thank all of you for joining us. During 2019, 4.5 billion people traveled by air, an industry that also represents a third of world trade and employs more than 65 million people. The coronavirus pandemic was devastated the sector. Closed borders, people locked down, and thousands of planes on the grounds are clear evidence of this. Air connectivity will be indispensable for the reactivation, but now the focus is on aviations and, most importantly, on reorganizing the confidence of travelers, which is why we have with us today James Wiltshare of IATA External Affairs Department. James is currently working on the passengers' fitness to fly programs and also the current management of border restrictions. All of this as part of the COVID-19 post-crisis research efforts, of course. James is an economist by training and was working for IATA since August 2013. Prior to joining IATA, James worked for over 10 years in the UK Minister of Transportation in various roles and leads policy and analysis for UK Civil Aviation Authority. Welcome, James, and thank you for joining us today. As the world begins to plan for a return to normality, which includes opening borders and reviving tourism, among other things, the aviation sector faces a double challenges. For one side, restoring its service after the greatest disruption in the history, and doing so amidst disparate regulation. And the key here is the decision making by the state and the government. So the air connectivity is fundamental to the economy and, of course, make a relationship with the financial situation in a lot of regions of the world. Therefore, an effective recovery of international air transport is absolutely essential now to support the global economy recovery for the pandemic. The International Air Transport Association, IATA, calls for the adoption an homogeneous rule through the world to avoid the confusion of the passengers and million inexpensive for airlines and airport try to reduce the the crisis, the economic crisis. So my first question, James, is, will it be possible in the long term to achieve uniform regulation through the world to regain the confidence of travelers? This is possible?
Thank you. Thanks, Daniela. And first of all, good day, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches a todos. Estar aquí con ustedes en este webinar. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today in this webinar. I think the first thing to say to this question is that you talked of the post-COVID world and the post-COVID restart of aviation. It's clear that post-COVID is a long way away. We are going to be living with the virus for some time. And as the WHO said last week, travel bans can't carry on indefinitely through the crisis. And there are actually ways of minimizing the risks of international travel. And it's really that we are looking for states to do and to get away from some of the very knee-jerk responses that we're seeing around the world. In terms of the question about guidance, there already is a common set of guidelines for the air transport industry. They were developed by ICAO, that's the International Civil Aviation Organization. It's the UN body for aviation, which developed its takeoff guidance. And that had input from the US FAA, it had input from IATA here in Europe, as well as other authorities around the world. And that's being widely adopted by governments and also by industry stakeholders around the world, not least the airlines. Mm-hmm. So there is actually, in terms of the air travel experience, already something to work with, and I think that's very positive. In terms of the uniformity, maybe it's not possible to have, or even appropriate to have, uniformity given the different trajectory of the pandemic in different countries around the world. But what is important is to have a clear and transparent framework for decision making and consistency that can be communicated not just to industry stakeholders but also to travelers. What's clear to us from IATA's perspective is that there are two things which really undermine passenger confidence. One of those is quarantine, and the other of those, which is related, is where we see a stop-go approach in terms of the way that border restrictions are managed. And a classic example would be those countries who are now, having opened up the market for travel to Spain, are now reintroducing quarantine requirements. And that really, really undermines confidence.
Yes.
So I'll stop there, I think, for the sort of first answer to that.
The World Health Organization has published extensive guidelines with recommendations. Passengers should be confident that the air they breathe in the cabin is filtered, that aircraft are cleaning to global standards, that major airports have implemented temperature control for travels, and a lot of things that I can read a few days ago. We know that airlines are developing standards and best practice linked to the international health regulation. But when will we have the standards that are fully applicable to airlines? I know that you are working on it.
Yes, absolutely. So within IATA, very early in the pandemic recovery phase, we developed a Biosafety Roadmap, and that included measures for passengers in terms of fitness to fly, which you already mentioned, the airport experience, and also the onboard experience. And to give an example of things that includes, in terms of the onboard experience, that would be reduced movement on board, simplified catering service, use of face coverings. All of those elements were picked up in the ICAO takeoff guidance that I talked about, and that is being implemented by airlines around the world, and with the the backing of civil aviation authorities and other regulators around the world. So I think that guidance largely exists as regards to air travel itself.
Mm-hmm. According to the last surveys, air quality in the cabin and social distance are some of the main concern of travelers. Why is the risk of contagions in the airplane low? Is it safe to travel by plane with approximately 50 centimeters between passengers? This is the rumor that normally now we hear about the air transportation.
Yeah, no, really good questions. So I'm going to take it in three parts. The first thing is, what's the underlying risk, essentially, without any mitigation measures of transmitting COVID? And you talked about the risk of transmission being low on board, and that's absolutely what we see. And in terms of why that is, firstly, an aeroplane is quite a disciplined environment if you compare it to other modes of transport, like an urban bus or an urban tram or something, where people are getting on and getting off all the time. They may be standing, they might be facing each other. On an aircraft, people sit for most of the flight. Most of the seats facing the same direction, forwards. You have high seat backs in terms of that creates a natural barrier in terms of catching any droplets that are expelled. In terms of the airflow, it's primarily ceiling to floor. So any droplets that are in the air tend to move downwards quite quickly. Again, that's different to other less ventilated environments. And very finally, aircraft, particularly modern jet aircraft, which perform the bulk of routes, have what are known as Hepa filters, high extraction particulate filters, which screen out 99% of small particles the size of a coronavirus molecule. It's really the same kind of technology that's used in surgical operating theatres. And these HEPA filters don't just extract lots of all these particles, but they mean that the air is recirculated every 2 to 3 minutes. So compared, as I said, again, compared to other environments, other modes of transport, the air is circulating really quickly. It's cleaned, it's fresh air, much cleaner than you get in other environments. So all of that gets us to the view that the risk of transmission on board is low. And that's absolutely what we've seen through the early phases of the pandemic. We have seen very few cases of infection through air travel. We know that in the early phases, lots of infected passengers traveled, primary cases, but we've done a lot of the contact tracing and following up with airlines and authorities. And what we haven't seen is a large number of secondary cases. That's people who were traveling, started the journey not infected, and subsequently became infected with COVID. Out of 18.5 million cases of COVID globally, we know, and we've looked very hard and we've worked with airlines very closely, we know of less than 100 cases, a lot less than 100 cases of transmission on board. So that gives us quite a good starting point. And then, of course, there are the measures I talked about. So the simplified catering, the reduced movement on board, the reduced interaction between passengers and crew, and the wearing of the face coverings over and above this already low risk. So finally, I get to answer your question. Is flying safe even with a full plane? Overwhelmingly, I say yes, it is safe. And not just is there a good set of arguments why that's the case, the evidence backs it up.
Because I repeat my question, because in maybe 2 months ago, we hear that will be a possibility to don't put full of the seat in one line. But then suddenly the company said, no, we will full all the seat with people, not one seat free in the middle, right?
And the regulators support that. I think that's
Yeah.
an important point to note is we start with a low risk of transmission on board for all the reasons I set out. Then we overlay some additional measures on top of that. And it's very much like the guidance in other environments. Maintain social distance. If you can't maintain social distance, wear a face covering. And we start with a low risk and we add the face coverings in and some other measures. And we believe that the risk is really very low, that the transmission risk is not the one that is causing the concern right now. And that's covered by the guidance that I've talked about.
Okay.
Yeah.
After the 11 September attacks, the security measure in airports changed and increased. Do you remember about it? Everything. It does not seem unreasonable to believe that we are about to witness new development in this area. New boarding procedures, mandatory wearing of mask, greater restrictions, and continuous temperature measurements. Could you give us a preview of what change we can expect our future flights a part of this?
Okay, really good. Look, 9/11 is a really good example to use. It's a good example of a bad example, I might say. The security measures that were imposed after 9/11 changed the travel experience. But what didn't change was that those security measures never went away. They were introduced and they've never been removed, even though they may no longer justified or they've been superseded by other alternatives. We're still doing security in the way that we did after 9/11 or a few years later after the liquid and gels rules were introduced.
Correct.
Something we've been really keen to focus on to learn the lessons of 9/11 with this COVID outbreak. I've talked about the measures that IATA is promoting and the airlines are adopting, and they make sense. They make complete sense in the current situation, but they should only be in place for as long as they're necessary. And we've been very clear in our messaging to governments that there should be clear procedures in to review those measures, to see whether they're still justified, and to remove them if they're not justified, or to replace them if there's a better alternative that does the same risk mitigation with less disruption to the traveler's journey.
So you try to explain us that will be more flexibility?
I think the first thing is to say, currently travel and air travel, but all travel is very different to what we were used to 6 months, a year ago. And some of that's going to continue during the outbreak. But it shouldn't continue once a vaccine is in place or once therapeutics are available that mean that the virus is very different in terms of its impact on health. It's the first thing. And equally, they should be proportionate to the risk level. So an example is New Zealand. So New Zealand has very little COVID, as you probably know, and it may well be cut off from the rest of the world. But if you fly domestically in New Zealand, actually it feels like before COVID, frequent flyer lounges are open, there's no face coverings on board, there's no social distancing in the terminals because it's not justified. And we're suggesting and we're arguing to governments that the risks, the measures should be proportionate to risk and only in as needed. The other thing to say though is how do we think things are going to change? There are opportunities, bizarre as it may seem, coming out of COVID to do things differently going forward. And one of those, I think, is about the use of technology, smarter approaches, contactless technology to remove friction from the passenger experience. So using apps, using web portals, using biometrics more. Something that is obviously makes complete sense when you're trying to reduce touch points.
The risk, yeah.
But actually, it makes perfect sense to do it anyway. And we would like, that's something we've been advocating through our One Identity program. And so there are areas of opportunity as well. And we are looking into those.
What will be the recovery phases of the air routes? Your information or your knowledge now.
So we've always taken the view from the very beginning that it's going to be very much in phases, and that the first phase of that will be in domestic markets where there's not particularly larger domestic markets where border restrictions obviously aren't relevant. Then on a bilateral basis, in states with the best aligned conditions, we're likely to open up their travel to each other on a bilateral basis. Then we anticipate seeing regional travel recover. And lastly and latest, intercontinental long-haul travel. I think the other thing to say on top of that is probably expect to see leisure travel recover faster than corporate and business travel. And there are a number of reasons for that. But that does reflect what we're seeing. And probably the final thing to overlay on that, obviously it will also change in different regions based on the evolution of the pandemic itself.
And do you think that they will change people travel habits?
There's a huge amount of speculation on this question. It's very I'd say in the short term, very clearly, yes, obviously it is, it has to. And, the longer the pandemic goes on, I think the longer it will take for people to get back to the way things were. And so we updated our economic analysis last week, and we suggested that the recovery to the 2009 levels of demand won't be now until 2024, where previously we'd been estimating that would be 2023. So it will take longer for international travel to get back to the growth patterns it was on. But, in the longer term, I'm really still optimistic that the reasons that people travel, and let's not forget, people travel for a reason, those still remain, face-to-face contact for doing business. It's, I'd love to be in the same room as all of you today having this conversation rather than doing it via Zoom. I think we all have a level of fatigue from Zoom and Teams and all of that. It's not the same level of interaction. And from the leisure as well, I think people still are going to want to experience these things. The zeitgeist is experiential based, and I think that will return. I think there are a couple of things that I base that on. One, as you said, I'm sort of an economist by background, and what we've seen from the history of forecasting is that people tend to be over-optimistic in the good times and think it'll go on forever. And then they tend to be unduly pessimistic in the bad times. And I hope that that's the case again, that being unduly pessimistic and things will recover. And just finally, just to give some anecdotes from Europe, I talked about the negative case of the reintroduction of quarantine for Spain. But we are seeing that where travel has reopened and the borders are staying open, people want to fly, and we're seeing carriers bringing back capacity quicker than they'd intended because the demand is there to do so. And it's actually more than they expected. So I think, people do want to travel, and I don't think that's going to change fundamentally in the long term. Yeah.
Well, we have a lot of questions for the audience. So one of the hot questions that I have for you is in relationship with the insurance and the consumer protection. So after the pandemic, there were thousands of claims for ask money in relationship with a ticket. This, I think, creates a lot of problems in the industry. Angry passengers, travel agency in complicated situation, economic and financial situation. Will be a greater guarantee for passengers regarding their rights as the customers? And James, I understand that you are also in charge of the management of IATA in matter of consumer protections, right? So we have here a lot of people came from tour operator or agency, so they are very interested in your answer.
Okay, that's less friendly territory then. Look, I mean, I think what we saw in the early stages of the pandemic was that the current consumer protection regime, particularly here in Europe with the Regulation 261 for air travel, is just completely not fit for purpose. It doesn't work for passengers, and it didn't work for carriers, and no doubt it didn't work for travel agents either. An example of that, there's still no clarity around whether, for the purposes of the Regulation 261, COVID-19 counts as an extraordinary circumstance. And I would have thought that a pandemic the likes which we haven't seen for 100 years would really be the very definition of a extraordinary circumstance. Yet the European Commission won't give clarity on that. Some national enforcement bodies were saying it should be, and that extraordinary circumstances conditions should apply, while the Commission's now taking enforcement action against those enforcement bodies. So there's real, I think, confusion, and there's an urgent need to refresh that framework to make sure it works for everybody in the industry.
We have, again, a lot of questions about this. You can imagine, because I can understand, no? The pandemic broke the law and the regulation between the clients, the tour operator, the agency, the hotels, the airlines. So now it's a disaster, because a lot of people lost money, and they can, claim. So this is a gray area now, and the expectation in relationship with IATA is huge. This is the point.
Mm-hmm.
This is the point. Well, we will come back again if we have more questions about it, but we will continue. What will the affairs be like after the pandemic? I hear a lot of speculation about it. Offers, sales, high prices. What is your opinion, or what is your feeling in relationship with your sector?
Well, I will look into the same crystal ball that you've been looking into, I guess, because some of it's speculation, and then some of it we can answer by looking at the different drivers of fares, right? And I guess on the one hand you have good old economics. It's supply and demand, or it's the costs and it's the revenues. And for the moment, overall demand is weak. Many travelers are still looking to regain that confidence that you talked about. And let's be honest, we're not just in a travel and tourism crisis, we're in an economic crisis which is affecting everybody. So people are scared about their job, if they still have a job, they may not have a job. And so the demand is weaker than it would be normally. And as a result of that, it stands to reason that airfares are weak. And part of getting people back onto planes and getting people back into travel and tourism is through price stimulation. And that's part of it. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, that we've got to understand that responding to COVID-19 isn't free. There's a lot of cost involved to, the whole travel and tourism supply chain in terms of adopting new measures. Maybe it is accepting lower load factors in some cases. Maybe it's putting in place mitigation measures, additional cleaning and sanitization, not just within the airlines, but also within the airports and within the suppliers. All of these things don't come for free, and at some point they have to be fed through into the price. And also, it's been huge financial pain for the carriers, and even where there has been government assistance, often that's been in the case of loans, and those loans will need to be repaid. And so the airlines are going to be saddled with debt, much higher levels of debt going forward. And so those are drivers which point to the fact that fares will struggle to be as low as they have been previously. Yeah. At the same time, we have a very, very long-term trend in air transport for connectivity to go up, and for fares to come down in real terms, and that, that's driven by competition and by innovation, and that may well be the case that continues. So we will see. It's a lot of different drivers and how they play out.
And at the end it's market regulation, right? So we have a lot of questions in relationship with the insurance and reimbursement. So one of the most controversial issues during this crisis has been the reimbursement of tickets by the airlines, not only directly to the consumer, but also to the travel agency. Is IATA working on any special program to protect agency and the customer? This is one question. And another is more or less the same one. Our biggest concern is travel insurance. Is IATA lobbying the industry to insure travel against COVID-19 when traveling?
Okay, I'll take those in turn. So the first one on the reimbursements or the issuing of vouchers, I guess, which is what the airlines asked to be able to do in response to the pandemic. But, let's be honest, the airlines rely on their relationships with the end consumer and with the agents, the intermediary for many of those consumers, and we don't have an interest in upsetting either of those. But at the same time, I think we need to sort of understand the context of what was happening during, particularly the early stage of the COVID outbreak. At the start of the year, the typical airline only had a couple of months of cash reserves, around 2 months on average. Some had more, many had much less. And as government started to impose border restrictions and to shut down travel and to issue travel advisories, that meant that outbound travel was also restricted. The airlines were faced with a situation where the cancellations and refunds far exceeded new sales. So they started with only 2 months of cash, and then these refunds were burning through that cash even quicker because they were having negative revenue. And we were in a situation where for many carriers, their liabilities in terms of the value of unsold tickets was greater than their cash reserves. So we were in a situation very quickly where we'd have seen large numbers of airlines going out of business very quickly. And that wouldn't have been good news for passengers. It wouldn't have been good news for travel agents. And obviously, it's not good news for the carriers. I think in the Lancet, we talked about that. I just talked about that long-term trend of increased choice, increased competition, increased value in terms of lower airfares. That's because of a strong and vibrant and dynamic airline sector with lots of competitors in it. That's in the consumer interest, and letting large numbers of airlines fail wouldn't have been. So I know it's a controversial issue. I know it's very sensitive to many of the people on the webinar, but I also need to give some of the context there around just how vulnerable things were for many of the carriers at the start of the year. On the subject of insurance, absolutely, that's something that's been highlighted as a real barrier to both corporate and leisure demand. Mm-hmm. Now, passengers are very wary of quarantine and particularly wary of the potential costs of having to fund quarantine at destination. And for corporates, they're not going to let their staff travel around the world if they aren't insured. It's just not going to happen. They've got their duty of care to their employees. So the availability of insurance products that cover COVID-19 at a price that isn't prohibitive is a real concern for us. We have insurance experts within IATA, and we've been engaging with the commercial sector very, very strongly. I would say in the last few weeks, our optimism about the availability of COVID compliant insurance products has increased. Actually, it was something probably a month ago we were very concerned about. We think it's looking more likely that commercial products will be available, but where they aren't, we are exploring alternatives, and those could be some level of government underwriting. And you will have seen also that there are carriers that are innovating themselves. So Emirates is committed to covering the costs of passengers if they travel and they contract COVID. So we recognise that it's a hugely important issue, and we are hopeful to see a commercially based resolution to it.
Yeah. We have another question for the audience. What can airlines do if a passenger refuses to wear a mask? What will be the policy in relationship with this?
Okay, a really good question. And before I was coming on this webinar, I was talking to airline lawyers about exactly this topic. So hopefully I'm prepared in terms of an answer. I think there are two things. One is relying on national law. So where it's a mandatory requirement, it helps if it's a mandatory requirement in both the departure state and the receiving state. In which case that would get dealt with by the authorities, and there are protocols for that. And the second case is where it's being done under airline condition of carriage. So the airline can state it as a condition of travel, and anybody that refuses to comply is in breach of the conditions of travel, and again is subject to prosecution. The one complexity, and I talked about the difference between the origin and the destination state. There is an international legal framework under ICAO for this. It's the Montreal Protocol 2014, and it really helps if both the departure state and the arrival state have signed that protocol, because if they don't, there is a potential legal loophole if the arrival state won't prosecute for something, seeing it's the jurisdiction of the departing state. But no, there are strict legal protocols around it.
Okay, great. Another question for the audience: Does IATA force any change in future aircraft technology to make them more sustainable in the future?
Sustainable in terms of environmental commitments, or sustainable from a
the ambient, I think.
Okay, so in terms of I guess in a COVID context, we're actually doing a lot of research work with the major manufacturers and also with NASA to really get even stronger evidence around some of the points I talked about at the start. So the airflow, the mitigation of the seat backs, the effectiveness of the Hepa filters and so on, in terms of quantifying precisely how much those mitigate the transmission risk. As I said, our strong view is that the risk of transmission on board with existing aircraft technology is very low. And as I said, we've seen that in the numbers. So, great if we can get even better, but we think that the aircraft in the cabin environment is already very safe in that respect. And if it was sustainable in terms of environmental objectives, then the industry has a very ambitious set of environmental targets, and that's not just airlines, that's airlines, airports, manufacturers. In terms of carbon neutral growth going forward, and getting to a 50% reduction versus 2005 levels by 2050. There's nothing about the COVID pandemic that has changed the industry's commitments to its environmental goals. Absolutely. The fundamental pillar of the industry's objectives going forward will be based around those environmental commitments, and we absolutely stick to them.
The recovery of the tourism sectors depends to the revival, the sectors, the aviation, of course, and the routes. So what is your expectation, real expectation about this for response to the demands? And another question from the audience, have relationship with the quarantine, the famous 14 days. We have a critical situation now in Spain with the UK decision. Do you know about it? So how do you think that IATA can manage or not, or influence to the governments to this decision? Because of course the air transportation is the key here for reopen and restart the sector.
No, absolutely. So look, I mean, the two sides of the same coin in the answer. So your first thing is you asked about responding to demand.
Yes,
that's what airlines do. You know, where there is demand, airlines will fly. And you know, I've already given the example of carriers that have increased the rate at which they're putting capacity back into the market because they're seeing more stronger demand than they'd maybe anticipated, and they're responding to that, and they're putting more flights on. You know, there are lots of aeroplanes grounded at airports. You know, here in Geneva, there's a bunch of them parked around the perimeter of the airfield, and it's very sad to drive past them every day and to see them not having moved. You know, airlines belong in the sky, and that's what they should be doing. And so where there's that demand, you know, absolutely the airlines want to do that. That'll get them their planes back in the sky, their business up and running, and you know, mitigate the job losses and failures and so on that we see. So I think that's a given. The problem that you've talked about, you've just touched on, is the border restrictions and the quarantine requirements. I think those are the real problem.
Yes,
it's what we're seeing. And from an IATA perspective, the message that we're delivering to governments, and we need to recognize that it's often public health authorities and border agencies who aren't people that we know as well as civil aviation authorities, travel ministers, tourism ministers, who are our natural friends and allies and with whom we have relationships. We have much less with health authorities. So it's harder to build that up. But I think what we're explaining to them is we're in a very different situation to where we were 6 months ago. We know much more about the virus. Health authorities do, industry does. We have measures in place, those takeoff guidance that I talked about, the mitigation measures, the use of face coverings. We can manage the impacts of COVID, and particularly that transmission risk. And the World Health Organization said last week, travel bans can't continue indefinitely. You know, there are ways of minimizing the risks of international travel, and that's what we're asking governments to do, to be proportionate, to be risk-based, and to not respond with such blunt instruments as border closures and quarantine. I think one of the key elements we see here is testing. I think we see, you know, a lot of potential for testing technology to really very significantly reduce the risk of importation. I guess, you know, we need to understand there are two things with air travel. One is transmitting while traveling. We have very good mitigations to that. And then is somebody infected traveling and going to another country or returning to a home country. And testing can do an awful lot to mitigate that risk without the need for quarantine. Much more proportionate.
Another question from the audience in relationship with the prices of the tickets. From Brazil, one of our members asked, in relationship with, in Brazil, airlines are selling cheap tickets to Europe now, but we don't know when Europe will be able to enter or the restriction in the future. Is this a correct practice without knowing that will be happening or not, or will be possible to travel? What can IATA do in this situation or recommend in this situation? This is true because in Latin America, you know, the markets not stop. They promote and sell the tickets with a very, very good price, low price, for incentive the people who can buy them. But the problem is they don't know really if they will be able to use this ticket in the future.
Okay, really, really good question and a complex one. And I think almost start by asking the counterfactual. You know, if we wait until the border restriction is open before we put the flight on sale, how long does it then have to be before you get enough people to make that flight marketable? And again, it's one of the things that we're asking for governments is, tell me what your criteria are, or tell us what your criteria are. What are your objective measures? Be transparent about that for market reopening. If it's around infection rates and trends in infection rates, could you tell us what the thresholds are? Because then airlines can plan on that basis. They can look at what their infection rates are and say, well, we think it's realistic that September, October, November, that market will be reopening. And passengers can do the same thing. They can make plans whether it looks likely that there might have to be a restriction or a testing requirement or whatever put in place between the UK and Spain, for example. So I think that's the first thing is be clarity around the conditions. I talked about also, you know, the lead time for sales. What we saw with the reopening of the EU, both intra-Schengen in mid-June, and then the EU safe list that was published for the start of July, is the difference between when that was announced and when it came into force was a couple of days. And that isn't long enough for airlines or any travel business to plan effectively. So if you started at that point, you'd be waiting several weeks before you had a flight between Brazil and Europe. And that's not what passengers want. There is that pent-up demand. That's why people are buying their travel. What I would say is that, you know, given the uncertainties, the airlines are offering a lot of flexibility right now, offering complementary changes. If the passenger isn't allowed to travel because of a border restriction, or the passenger isn't allowed to travel because they themselves are unhealthy, you know, with infection rates, that's going to happen. Airlines don't want sick people traveling, so if are they symptomatic or they suspect they might be symptomatic, airlines are offering a lot of that flexibility. So that should give some comfort to passengers. But it's really tricky. And the more clarity we get from governments, I think it's going to help everybody. Yeah, of course. Another question I think that the people are afraid, and many questions came from this side. Can IATA lobby or put pressure on the USA government to put a federal mandate in place for face covering? Currently, there is none, so the people are afraid about it. What is the lobby or the pressure that IATA can do with the government for use mask in a mandatory way? I mean, the guidance that I talked about, the ICAO guidance talks about the use of face coverings. IATA's recommendations talk about the face coverings. The FAA was part of the US Federal Aviation Administration, was part of the process of putting those guidance in place. And the US Department for Transport's own, Department of Transportation's own guidance talks about the use of face masks. And you know, the airlines require it. It's part of their conditions of carriage. So whether additional measures are required, whether they provide some legal certainty, I don't know, but we're certainly advocating through multiple channels that face coverings are an important part of the mitigation solution. Not just on board, by the way, but throughout the travel journey, in the airport, at the various in the airport. All the process. Yeah. And another big topic, and we receive a lot of questions in relationship with the test.
Since UK does test result in 3 hours, can IATA help mandate the airlines to provide a possibility to test travelers and offer a date change in case positive? This will help with demand generations.
Okay, so I think two things. One is about the role of the airlines or the airport or anybody in terms of performing the test. What we would say is it's probably best done by health authorities. And you talked about that 3-hour time period for getting the test results and using the gold standard PCR test. That's defined by biology, not by technology. So that PCR test, whether that be the nasal swab or a saliva test, isn't going to get much quicker than 3 hours. It physically can't. That's sort of the limits of biology. So there's a real question with that length of time, whether the airport is the best place to get that test done, or whether it's best done in the community before somebody sets off for travel, either the morning of travel for an evening flight or maybe the night before for a morning flight. I think there are some advantages to that. Clearly, it's an additional trip that the passenger would need to take. But equally, they wouldn't get to the airport and then find that they've been denied travel because they've tested positive. Equally, the airport wouldn't have to put aside lots and lots of space for holding people socially distanced while they're getting their test results. So it's the practicalities of it are complex, and there are multiple views on this one. But based on the current technology, we advocate for testing prior to travel. We do think it's really potentially very helpful. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing is when and where should it be done? Really, it should be done by health professionals prior to travel, and actually the sharing of results should be done between the passenger and the authorities of the receiving country. And we quite favour the travel authorization model as a way that just the passenger gets an okay to fly, and it's that the airline verifies, or the airport even. The second question is around name change, or date change in the case of a positive test. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing airlines are doing voluntarily because they want passengers to be able to book with confidence. They are offering that flexibility. At least one free change if you test positive, or in many cases where testing isn't widely available in the community, even if the passenger suspects that they're positive, the airlines are offering that flexibility because they don't want that person traveling to the airport and potentially infecting other people at airport, and they don't want them on the aircraft. They'd much rather they stay at home and rebook for a time when they're able to travel. So
we have a lot of questions, so it will be impossible to answer all the things. So I propose, Jane, for you to read this and put in clear and send to you, and maybe you can answer in writing, and we can share the answers with our members. But many questions have relationship with the flexibility in relationship with the sales, the insurance, the refunds, and of course we repeat several times in relation to what will happen in the medium and short term with the sector. What is your feeling in your experience? Of course, this is new for everybody, but if you're in, because we are now in August, do you think that this year will be more or less normal way to restart the sector, or many people think that this between September, October, November, December will be more or less like now, and the next year with the vaccine, maybe the scenario will change? What is your feeling or your information that we collect from your sector?
Wow, that's a huge question. And again, I'll go back to my crystal ball. I wish I knew the answer. And, you know, I think the first thing to say is it will be driven by, I guess, three things will drive it. The first is the evolution of the pandemic itself, in terms of controlling case numbers and new infections around the world. And second will be government responses to that. If governments respond in the same way they have done up to now, I think things will be quite slow, particularly if there are spikes and rebounds in cases and governments reimpose lockdowns and quarantine, as I've said. I think if they are smarter in their responses, given that we know much more than we did 6 months ago, and they respond in a way that enables markets to keep open and keep borders open, then I think that would be a very different scenario. And the third factor is going to be the extent of the economic crisis that's going with the public health one, and the impact that has on both leisure and business demand. As I say, if we can be successful in as an industry, and I think here we're all in partnership, encouraging governments to be more rational and risk-based and proportionate in keeping borders open with things like testing in place of quarantine, then I think we can start to see a sustained recovery in demand. And then I think as we move towards a world possibly with a vaccine, or possibly with therapeutics that enable the most severe cases of the disease, COVID disease, to be treated and therefore reduce mortality and the amount of severe cases, then I think we could be in a very different world. I think potentially we see quite a rapid recovery once those conditions are in place, potentially in 2021. But obviously, we're starting from a low base right now.
The secret will be we must rebuild trust, not only to the clients in the sector, between tour operators, between airlines, between a lot of part of this big change now about the commercial in tourist sector. So will be a challenge for everybody. I know that you have several and continuous meetings with all the big companies in your sector. What is the feeling that you receive? They are positive, they are worried, because we know that was a real disaster for the people who lost the jobs and the company. So what is your final conclusion in relationship with where is the sector now?
You know, look, the sector has never seen anything like COVID-19. Certainly in the history of the air transport industry, which commercial air transport's, I guess, 105 years old, we've never seen anything like this. The level of demand destruction that we've seen, the amount of grounded aircraft, it's completely without precedent. Not just compared to something like 9/11 or the financial crisis, which was very sharp but very focused in terms of particular areas. This is deeper, longer, more widespread than anything we've ever seen. And you know, the airlines are all in a very, very suffering very badly, as I'm sure all travel and tourism businesses that have been shut down for many months are. In terms of the long-term prospects for air travel, as I said, I'm optimistic that the reasons that people travel, again, for both leisure, for business, for visiting friends and family, those fundamental drivers remain. And that's why I do think that once the pandemic is under control and we have governments putting proportionate risk-based measures in place, and we can rebuild that confidence, and as you say, that is absolutely critical, and not just confidence that I won't catch the virus, but confidence that I can book today and my flight won't be cancelled because of a border restriction tomorrow or whatever, or I won't be put in quarantine. Once we can satisfy that requirement, I'm confident that demand will recover, and that demand will breed demand and confidence will breed confidence. As people start talking about their travel experiences and travel becomes something that's normal again, then demand will become self-reinforcing. But we do need to get to that stage.
We hope so.
Yeah.
Well, we have now come to the end of our webinar today. So thank you, Jane, for your participation. We hope to be able to restart really travel in a few months so that our industry can be reactivated as soon as possible. This is for us the priority. Also, thank you to all of you, and we look forward to see you at our next webinar. Thank you, James, so much. I know that you are so busy during this day working with a lot of things and challenges. So thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.